Hello, I'm David Farland. The truth is, I love watching the other young writers, and I like working with them and helping them avoid the mistakes that most of us make in our writing careers. I enjoyed. I kind of look at them and go, "Oh gosh, these are my kids." I like watching their successes and just watching them grow up and win other awards and become bestsellers and that type of thing.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its scenes while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, neath the halo of a street lamp. I turned my collar to the cold and damp, when my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night into touch the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs and voices never shared. And no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words and I might teach you. Take my arms and I might reach you. But my words, like silent raindrops fell, and echoed in the wells of silence. And the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And the sign flashed out his warning, and the words that it was forming. And the sign said the words on the prophets are written on the subway walls, and tenement halls, and whispered in the sound of silence.
Among our past writing winners, whether they be finalists or Gold Award winners, many have gone on to great success. Some have gone on to become bestsellers, and some have won the greatest honors in the field. Tonight's winning writers will continue that great tradition. The Golden Pen Award will give an added boost to one of our winners, and we're thrilled to present that honor now.
The Writers of the Future winner of the Golden Pen Award and grand prize check for $5,000 goes to the writer of the story. Did they give you the?
No, I don't have it. You have it? Here we go.
I do definitely want to thank David Farland.
I want to thank Dave Wolverton, who edited the anthology. He got some things that I didn't, and the story gained a lot of value because of Dave. He does great work, and I'm very thankful for that.
I would like to thank my teachers and mentors, including David Farland,
Dave Wolverton,
Dave Farland,
David Wolverton,
Dave Wolverton,
Dave Farland, who ran our workshop.
Dave Wolverton.
Dave,
And of course, David Farland. We're very appreciative of your sharing your knowledge with us.
David Farland. I've been reading your writing tips for a long time. I don't think you know how many people you help.
Hallelujah.
You're gonna go for a grandpa ride.
Now, shall we sing another song? Boom, boom, boom. Little baby rabbit was a good friend of mine. Mother and father, brothers and sisters used to come around all the time. He came down to our house just for a couple of days. And oh, he made me smile so much that I wish he could have stayed.
Bye. Hi. Bye. 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 Go. Go.
Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodman, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. This week's guest served over 2 decades in the U.S. Navy, where he was an anti-submarine warfare specialist and chief petty officer. He served in multiple American war fronts, including the Cold War standoff and the Persian Gulf crisis. He retired from the military to become a military consultant and novelist, which is where this podcast comes in. I read his novel, Sea of Shadows, and became very impressed with his prowess over the military thriller genre, and thus this interview. And if you're not familiar with this author now, you can thank me later. Welcome, Jeff Edwards.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and just as we were starting this, you told me that you also are an author of science fiction, so that's going to make this a double great interview we've got in store for everybody today. So your story, Sea of Shadows, is probably the most intense military thriller I've ever read. So how'd you come about, first of all, becoming a writer, and then we'll get into that one there, but how'd you end up becoming, like I said, an author?
Well, it's my father grew up during the Depression, and his father died when my dad was very young. And my father basically worked from the time he could walk. He was cutting kindling and delivering firewood and just doing whatever he could to help support his family. he didn't have much in the way of a traditional childhood. So when he had children of his own and it came time to tell us bedtime stories, he didn't actually know very many stories. So he used to make up stories about a chocolate milk drinking bear named Oliver and his best friend, a little boy named Charlie. Now, my dad's name was Charles Oliver Edwards, and it took me years to figure out that my dad's two main characters were both named after himself. But my father died when I was young as well. I was about 7, and about a year after my father died, I was telling an Oliver the Bear story to my younger brother, and I suddenly realized I couldn't remember how it ended. And I realized if I didn't write those stories down, I was going to lose them. So I started writing down my father's Oliver the Bear stories, and that was the beginning. And I've been writing ever since.
And you were how old then?
I was about 7.5, 8 years old.
Wow. So this has been virtually a lifetime of endeavor for yourself.
Yeah, it took me quite a lot. Yes, it has. It took me, another 2.5, 3 decades to actually write my first novel, to finish my first novel. I had many, many, many false starts, but I kind of knew where I wanted to go when I was about 7, 8 years old.
Wow. And then, so you actually had, was it 20 years or more in the military?
23.
23 years. So how'd that fit in there? Because you knew you wanted to become a writer, but then obviously you ended up in the Navy.
That also kind of a little bit ties back in with my father. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and I used to like to go down to the waterfront with my dad and stand down there on the wharfs. And Savannah is a big seaport. A lot of people don't know that. But I would see ships disappear over the horizon, and I would ask my dad where they were going. And he said he didn't know. He said they could be going to Europe or Asia or, just up the coast to North Carolina or something. He said there's no way for us to know where they're going, but they're going out there. And I always wanted to go out there. So at some point, after having read Robert Louis Stevenson and Edward L. Beach and writers of naval fiction and everything else, I thought it would be great if my career could somehow combine the two things that I loved, which is the sea and writing. So I went to sea to learn about the sea and to teach myself how to write.
Wow. I guess that was a definite practical application of wanting to learn what you're writing about, to actually serve in the military, anti-submarine warfare, and on 2 theaters, at least multiple theaters of wartime experience. So now on your show, I want to get right into this one here. Then we'll jump over to science fiction. But on your story, I mean, there's a lot of realism to it, and I was amazed at your characters. It's almost like reading just a regular journal of activity going on. Obviously, there's a lot of intensity connected with it, but the folks they're like regular folks, that are in there. The military personnel, the civilians. They're all like just what you'd read in a newspaper article. Is there some, I guess, design to doing it like that?
Well, the short answer to the question is yes, there absolutely is. The slightly longer answer to the question is this: I had no desire whatsoever to write military fiction. I was writing science fiction detective stories. I had actually just finished my first one. I finished my first science fiction detective novel, Dome City Blues, and my agent was shopping it around New York. And every time my agent walked in the door with this manuscript and acquisitions editors got a look at my credentials, they said, "Why isn't this guy writing military thrillers? He's an expert in anti-submarine warfare. It's like this guy chases submarines for a living, and that's pretty damn cool. Why isn't he writing about that?" So my agent, Don Gerard, the late Don Gerard, he's passed away a few years ago. A lovely, lovely man. He came to me and said, "That's an excellent question. Why aren't you writing military thrillers?" He said, I know you love them. I've seen your bookshelf. You got Edward L. Beach and Robert Louis Stevenson and Tom Clancy and Dale Brown and Michael D. Mercurio. He said, "You got shelves full of that stuff. I know you love it. Why aren't you writing it?" And I said, "I don't know what I can bring to this genre that hasn't already been done before. I don't want to take something that everybody else is already doing and repeat it." I could not see how I could write anything that would compete with Tom Clancy or James Cobb or somebody like that. So I basically said, I don't want to go there. And so my editor, I'm sorry, not my editor, my agent, after about a year and a half, maybe a year and a half of bugging me to write him to try writing a military thriller, he finally contacts me and he says, "I'll make you a deal." He said, "If you'll write me 10 pages of a military thriller, as God is my witness, I will never ask you for page number 11 if you don't want to write it." He said, "If you want to get me off your back, just write me 10 honest pages of a military thriller. I will never ask for page number 11. So my ship had just pulled into, I think, I always forget, it was United Arab Emirates. I always forget if it was Abu Dhabi or Dubai. It was one of those two places. And I had basically 72 hours off where I didn't have to do anything. And we had pulled in on a Friday, and I had the Friday off, and I had the Saturday and Sunday off. I didn't have anything to do. And I thought, I'm just going to go sit down. I'm going to bang out 10 quick pages to shut Dawn up. And then I'm going to go out and buy some shawarma and go walk around and do cool stuff like that. So I sat down to bang out 10 quick pages. And I have to tell you, I was preparing to do something in the Navy that we call sandbagging. Sandbagging is when you don't give somebody your best work, because I honestly didn't want to write a military thriller. And I was afraid that if I did good work, he was going to kind of push me into writing the rest of the story. And I didn't want to do that. So I sat down to bang out 10 quick pages. And frankly, my plan was to write 10 pages of crap just to get him off my back. And about 19 hours later, I'd worked almost completely around the clock. I finally went to bed. I was about 80 pages into the manuscript and completely in love with it, because what I had discovered that I could do that I had never seen before was exactly the thing that you hit on, that you spotted in my story, which is that I could tell a story about ordinary men and women working together to do extraordinary things. There's generally kind of a figure in military thriller novels. I call him the guy. He's generally got perfect teeth and washboard abs, and he can defuse a bomb and fly an F-18 and shoot like a sniper and fight like Jet Li. And I was in the Navy 23 years. I never met that guy. What I met were a lot of ordinary people who worked their butts off and sometimes really hung their lives over the edge to accomplish the mission and do the things that they thought were important. So I decided to write books about those people, and I've been doing it ever since.
Wow. So yeah, it's really, really impressive. Just there's no assuming anything on your characters there. The captain of the naval vessel, the CPO, who's like what seems to be the main character in Sea of Shadows. She's like, people, they're afraid. They're like, they get hurt, they get banged up. It's like real life. What would happen, that they survived is, that's going to expect, is one thing I hate is when, your hero, the protagonist or whatever, gets knocked off because, well, it was just his bum luck, that happens. Well, it doesn't happen in books I want to read. So fortunately, you don't have that, but there are people that you don't want to see, get killed off, lost. But that's actually, that's the reality of war. But it's just amazing how, you take a premise again on Sea of Shadows, and you kind of wonder, because of the realism, everything else that you put in there on the individuals, how much something like that could really be a facet of real life international drama, of what you did there. Sometimes the stories are real, they're over the top. And like you said, you've got the protagonist, he can shoot, sniper, he can outdo any, top-notch sniper, as well as defuse a bomb, as well as run, a mile and then do something and run another mile. That's just like, ain't going to happen, but you're going to have, your characters, when something happens, they get hurt, real life hurt, and it makes a difference. So it really adds to the realism of your storytelling.
Oh, thank you. It's, I tried to make it, you said something about it almost being like a journal. And while I tried to make the story self-contained, and I tried to make the story work for people who've never been around the military and don't know anything about it, I very much wanted to convey the idea that the people out there doing this, sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes get them hurt. Sometimes they do the right thing. Sometimes they do the wrong thing. Sometimes they do the dumb thing. It's just that's how it works. Mm-hmm. And I think I've seen too many movies and read too many books where the main characters are just, they're flawless. They're paragons of brilliance and bravery and everything else. And I don't know, the real people I served with they got scared. Sometimes you're so scared your knees are shaking, but you step up and do the job because, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the determination that some things are more important than fear.
That's a great definition there. That's really, really good. Now, one thing that also your characters there, did you read the book by Owen Hubbard called Final Blackout?
I'm about halfway done with Final Blackout, and I'm loving it. I've always thought of kind of as Battlefield Earth as being L. Ron Hubbard's masterpiece. But I have to tell you, there's a case to be made for the fact that even though this is not kind of an epic sci-fi novel the way that one is in terms of length and scope and grandeur and everything, but just in terms of the quality of the story and kind of the socio-political dynamics and everything else, this is right there in the running with it.
Yeah, it's interesting how he talks about, because he wrote it. I mean, he wrote the book before World War II, and then he did an intro to it after World War II, and which qualified it as science fiction, because World War II hadn't happened yet when this war took place. And it's interesting, some of these famous military fiction writers like Greg Dinallo, Harold Robbins, what they said about, and several military units have actually used Final Blackout as part of their officer training school. Just the lieutenant, just this unnamed person just called the lieutenant, his qualities and characteristics of keeping his men alive and how he deals with that is just amazing. But it's interesting how he's like, he dedicated to the men and officers with whom I served in World War II, first phase, 1941 to 1945. So it's one of my favorite military fiction stories. And I've read, the same authors that you mentioned as well. But this is one he was accused. I don't know if you also noticed in the intro that he wrote, he was accused of being a communist, a fascist. He's accused of all kinds of things because of how he wrote it, because it was just for him, the lieutenant was there. His job was to keep his men alive, and that was paramount to anything else. And he didn't think too kindly of the career officers. He also saw what happened there, and he wrote quite a bit about too with what happened in Pearl Harbor with those in charge not following their own policy on how to deal with situations when you've got negotiations happening with hostile forces.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't remember the exact figure, but I remember reading a book. I think the title was Silent Service, and it was about the history of U.S. submarines at war. And in the book, and I've never actually independently looked up this little factoid, but it sounds like it's true, and I'm thinking that it probably is. And with 5 minutes of research, we could probably confirm it. But the book suggested that shortly after the outbreak of World War II, of the U.S. getting into World War II, not the initial hostilities, prior to the U.S. involvement, but shortly after the U.S. got involved in World War II, within the first few months, they had to relieve about 40% of their submarine skippers, of their submarine captains, because it turns out that people who are perfect officers in peacetime and perfect administrators and trainers and everything else sometimes are not very good at actually rolling their sleeves up and getting the job done when it comes time to fight. And so it's interesting that you can have people, including admirals and generals, who built a perfectly sterling career and everything looks great on paper. And then when it comes time to actually make contact with the enemy, it all falls apart.
Yeah, no, it's true. And that's unfortunately, what happened. But I'm sure it'd be very easy to document. You're talking about the thing on, like, you were obviously Anti-Submarine, and that's one thing that L. Ron Hubbard was as well. He was there off of Port Orchard there on the West Coast, dealing with the German submarines, German U-boats right there that were attacking and sinking ships. And that never really made a whole lot of popular coverage by the media, because nobody wanted to know that the enemy was off our shores. But
people were much more comfortable with the idea that the enemy was in the Atlantic.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a lieutenant, I don't know if you saw any of the photos that we have in that where he was captain of the.
I did, of a destroyer. Yep. Yep. He's a tin can sailor like me, except I was never captain.
Yeah. So he was and he definitely wrote about his engagements off of the off the shore there in Oregon and Washington, just with with the U-boats. And so did you actually have then, I mean, the type of U-boats you talked about in your Sea of Shadows, those were intense. So is that the technology that's currently in use now?
Actually, the ones that I wrote about, Type 212s and Type 214s, have actually been outpaced by newer technologies yet. The book's got a few years on it now. But yeah, that's there was a period of time where diesel submarines was all there were. Diesel. Every navy in the world built and fought with diesel submarines, and that had submarines. And then the U.S. With the Nautilus, and started building nuclear submarines, and suddenly nuclear submarines were it. If you didn't have nuclear submarines, diesel submarines couldn't stay down very long. They couldn't. They didn't have very long legs. They couldn't run very long. So there were all these things that were kind of against them. So diesel submarines, non-nuclear conventional submarines, started to kind of become a joke. And somewhere around, I'm going to say, the mid '90s, the Germans the Germans and a couple of countries actually, among other than the Sweden, started to develop diesel submarines with many of the same technologies that were used aboard nuclear submarines. And they started to develop air independent propulsion systems and hydrogen fuel cell technology and all kinds of things. And suddenly we found ourselves up against a generation of new diesel submarines that were far quieter than anything we had any experience with, that could run longer, run deeper, run longer, stay down longer. And it became, in some cases, almost functionally transparent, the difference between going up against a nuclear fast attack submarine and a diesel fast attack submarine. So yeah, those submarines that I wrote about in the book were cutting edge at the time. They're even more advanced than that now. There's some scary stuff out there.
Wow, I mean, that was plenty scary there.
They were scaring the daylights out of me. I was still active duty when I was writing about it.
Wow. But obviously then, if you're going to have that technology, because it was really interesting too, how part of the research, you actually quoted from that one naval CPO about torpedoes, the history of torpedoes. Was that a pseudonym for yourself?
That was a pseudonym for myself.
I was wondering if that's what that was.
That was that David M. Hardy. In later books in the series, he actually has retired from the Navy and he's gotten his PhD. So he's consulting for the National Center on Strategic Analysis or something like that later in the book, later in the series. But there was an interesting thing as I was writing the book, and when I first started working on the book, that wasn't in there. And my agent, after having read maybe the first third of the manuscript, he said, "There's just so much cool stuff in here about torpedoes. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually show how they got to be as scary and dangerous as they are?" And so we started talking about that. And then we talked about Bertolt Brecht and Brechtian alienation. And we talked about Michael Crichton, because Michael Crichton was like the master of Brechtian alienation. You'd be reading a Michael Crichton novel, and then suddenly, say you're reading, say, the Andromeda Strain. You're reading about all these people carrying out actions and doing things, and the actions moving forward. And then you get a 2-page report right there in the manuscript on the history of Project Scoop, and this satellite program. And then you're reading along for another chapter, and then you get a 3-page report about how certain medications diffuse across the blood-brain membrane and things of that nature. And all of those things played into the story. And it's one of those things where, if you read them, they added a little bit of knowledge to to the rest of the story. And if you skipped over them entirely, the story still worked. But having them in there added this verisimilitude. It's like, wow, here's this real stuff right in the middle of this fiction novel. Isn't this kind of wild? And you can read it or not read it, depending on what your choice is. So we decided to try that because we'd never seen anybody do that in military fiction before. And that ultimately ended up kind of becoming my trademark. So it's like, in every military book I've written now, there's a fiction thread and a nonfiction thread. And by the time you get to the end of the nonfiction thread, you've got all kinds of information that kind of backfills some of the technologies about the fiction thread, if you're interested and if you read them.
What was really cool about that is that sometimes in storytelling, when you try to fill in, it'll drag a story out. If you're trying to fill in and provide some type of history or some context that can make it easier for you to understand what the story is, doing what you did there enabled you to do that without at all detracting from the story. It actually gave another dimension, which gave it much more depth and much more believability to what you were actually writing.
Well, thank you very much. The interesting thing is about the nonfiction chapters is other than the name of the person they're attributed to, which that's a pseudonym that I created for myself, like you said, other than the fictional character they're attributed to, every word in there is as true as I could possibly make it. It's based on the best research I can do and the best sources I could lay hands on, and interviews and historical documents and historical accounts and things of that nature. One of the interesting things is I get three flavors, it seems like, of readers, of people who kind of read my military fiction. One set looks at the military, at the nonfiction stuff, and goes, okay, whatever, I'll read that, and then move on to the next thing, and it doesn't bother them one way or the other. One set despises that part and says, I skip over those parts every time, and you know what, the story still works just fine without them. And the other set these are people that I get emails from, and they're like, can you please give me the full manuscript that you're quoting from here, that I could almost leave the fiction part alone and just read the nonfiction part. So I have people who think it's acceptable, people who think it's the best part of the book, and people who think I should have left it out entirely. And it just depends on the attitude of the readers. So far, the people who like it seem to outnumber the people who don't like it significantly. But I just think it's interesting that some people are indifferent, some people love it, some people hate it.
Yeah, it just adds so much more, I guess, that level of plausibility to your storytelling, which makes it all the more enjoyable to read. And then,
well, thank you.
The thing that makes it good, though, too, is you've got that, and there's some very tense, drama that happens in there. But if I have an author who I know that the situation is going to resolve at the end, and ultimately the good guy is going to win, which, there's plenty of stuff to read and to experience out there where it doesn't happen that way. I'm not interested in involving myself in that. It's just, if I want that, I can just go read the news. I get plenty of that every day. So if I know I'm going to get that, there's a few points in there I got really squeamish, like, oh man, do I really want to read this? Because it was so intense. But now that I'm familiar with you as an author and know how you're going to resolve it from my perspective, nicely, then I'm just total, I've got my pom-poms going full scale right now, telling people to read your stuff here, because it's really good. And one of the things I wanted to get into is your ability to write really good action that pulls somebody along. And there's obviously writing technology. And then I know that in Battlefield Earth, L. Ron Hubbard wrote stuff. And one of our Writers and Feature judges, Kevin J. Anderson, when he provided a blurb for that book, talked about he just got exhausted reading the book because it was just so intense, and it just kept on going and going and going. The short chapters, the short sentences, they really pull just a lot of action. And I found that also in your book as well, especially near the end. Like I said, I have a policy that when I go to bed at night, I won't read, because it's my time to be able to just talk about the day's events or what's going to happen in the next, near future with my wife. And this time I said, look, sorry, I got to finish this book. I can't not finish it. My heart was just beating so fast just thinking about it. So how is it that you do that? Because you definitely do it. And I want people listening to this, for aspiring writers, to know that there's a definite technology to writing, that the long sentences, the long paragraphs will like slow you down a little bit, and you can kind of like, okay, you can use that to catch your breath. And here, you've got the short chapters, you've got the short sentences, just the high action that you did there. There's a certain way of writing. And so I'm just curious how you went about doing it. I'm assuming it was intentional, because you definitely had me by, the short end of the leash there, pulling me along. But how you came about doing that?
I think to some degree, I was thinking in terms of, and this is going to sound strange, I was thinking in terms of military communications when I was doing that, which is to say that, when you're on a sound powered phone circuit or a radio circuit or something like that, and nothing is happening, and your ship's in no immediate danger, and your peacetime steaming, and nothing significant seems to be going on at that moment other than you're kind of keeping the watch and everything. Your communications tend to be very relaxed. Your sentence delivery can be slow and long, and you can have irrelevancies built in, and you can end up talking about the weather and the football game and the problem you're having with the transmission in your car, and things of that nature. And it's like you're communicating in one particular fashion, and then as soon as things start to heat up, communications become shorter and more direct, and absolutely more descriptive and more accurate. They become tremendously more concise. You've got to get out the right amount of information as quickly as possible and then pay attention to other things. So because that's kind of the way communication happens, in a warfare environment, you go from kind of this slow, methodically paced thing to suddenly the communication's moving very quickly. I decided to do that same kind of thing with my sentence structure. If you look in the chapters where there's no immediate threat and people are going through kind of routine things, the average sentence length is longer, the average length of the paragraph is longer. The chapters are still pretty short. That's kind of I tend to write short chapters. I don't know why, I just kind of do.
No, it's cool.
But I think it's because I never want to bore you, and I always want to give you a good place to stop if you need to go. If you need to go feed the cat or do the laundry or something. But I think I've always been trying to write in such a way that you can tell from the structure of the sentences and the structure of the paragraphs how much trouble you're in. So when they start getting shorter and faster and more kind of frenetic, that's because the world is moving faster and things are happening fast. And it just seems to work. I don't know why.
It does. Well, you're mirroring real life for sure. And you're right. You don't have time for the, and how's the family, and is the car still giving you problems there? Is that, you had that little pole on the left side there. It's like, no, you got the torpedoes coming in right now.
Yeah. Suddenly your communication amounts to check your six. And so it's like, you end up in a different world.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, some of the different slang and jargon that you use in there is different than Hollywood. And that's one thing I found very interesting.
It's, with a few notable exceptions, most of the slang and the pro words, the code words and stuff that I use in there are pretty reflective of what actually happens in the fleet. There are a few pro words that I wanted to use, code phrases I wanted to use, that are actually protected by NATO and stuff. So I had to come up with alternatives. For instance, the term sledgehammer as it gets used in the story, and the term anvil as it gets used in the story, those are substitutes for terms that are actually where the term itself is protected by NATO or protected by tactical doctrine. I don't know if you noticed on the back of the acknowledgments page, there's or not the acknowledgments page, on the copyright page, there's a statement that it's been reviewed by the Department of Defense and Security Office and what have you, and cleared for publication. Every book that I write, every piece of military fiction that I write, because I maintain an active clearance and stuff, has to get cleared by DoD and has to get cleared by the Pentagon. So I'm pretty careful about what I do there. And every once in a while they'll come back and they'll say, well, this piece over here isn't technically classified, but we'd really rather you didn't say that. Can we come up with an alternative? So generally the things that are in there, either they're spot on for how we do things in the military or in the Navy, or they capture the flavor, even if the details are different, to protect sensitive material.
I get it. No, that's another thing that I observe is that's not what they say on TV. That's not what they say in the movies. So that was,
that was generally not.
So what do you write for it? Because you write nonfiction as well as the fiction. So you write the nonfiction for the, is it just the Navy, or is it for military in general, or?
At the moment, the consulting work that I'm doing doesn't involve that kind of writing anymore. I used to write tactical publications, tactical warfare publications for anti-mine warfare and anti-submarine warfare. it's funny, one of the ways that some of those documents get written and some of that doctrine gets written is they used to do what they called ASW pizza parties, which they would bring in really, really, really smart tactical thinkers on anti-submarine warfare, and they would sit down for 3 weeks and they would hash out, okay, this is we think our procedures need to include this and this and this and this and this and this piece over here. Then we should do that. We should report it over here. This is how we should verify the accuracy of our sensors. This is how we, this is our alternate form of communication when our primary form of communication isn't working, whatever, all these details. And they would put them into this giant, basically massive document. And the good news is everything you wanted was in there. The bad news is it was written by 30 people and it looked like it was written by 30 people. It was an absolute mishmash of styles. So my job was to come in and do what they call making it reader agnostic, is the term that the Navy likes to use. My job is to make the entire tactical manual, 300 pages or 400 pages or whatever it is, read like it was written by one person. So my job is to distill all these different ideas and communicate them clearly and consistently and everything else. So I spent a great deal of time writing tactical manuals for the Navy, mostly for anti-mine warfare and anti-submarine warfare.
But like your story came up with, things change. So imagine even what you had back then and the book you wrote with Sea of Shadows, that's now totally antiquated technology too in terms of tactics for dealing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, the tactics that are in that book, I kind of made them up just because the last thing in the world I want to do is give the bad guys give enemies of the United States a look at our playbook. But again, it's one of those things where while the details are wrong, the flavor's right. It's like anybody who knows anti-submarine warfare will generally look at what I've written and go, that's not how we do it. But I absolutely understand why he said it that way. And this gives you the right feel, even if the details are wrong. And even if the details are wrong. And that's not an accident. But I will say this, one of the purposes of the book, one of the entire purposes of the book is to communicate the idea that you have to be willing to throw the tactical manual out the window as soon as you realize it's not working. I think
that was one captain, I forget his name right now, the senior who became the senior captain.
Yeah. Wiley.
Yeah, Wiley, unwilling. Well, he was unwilling to do that.
Yeah.
And
look where it got him. Yeah. I don't remember who said it now, but someone famously said that the hardest thing to do in professional sports is to walk into the halftime of a football team at the Super Bowl, walk into the locker room at halftime and completely change all the strategies that got them there to begin with because they're not working today. And it's like they've spent the entire season fighting to get to this moment. And now everything that they've trained themselves to do isn't working. And they're going to have to play the second half as a completely different game or they're not going to win. And one of the hardest things to do is to throw out everything that worked yesterday and last week and the week before. But sometimes you got to do that. As the tagline on the book cover says, sometimes the only way to survive is to change the rules.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very good, demonstration of that. And I realized, again, based upon how Owen Hubbard wrote in his Final Blackout, that, that was something that he dealt with as well back then in the 40s. Somebody said, okay, this is a procedure, we stick to it. And then if you're going to live, though, you can't follow those procedures if they're not working.
Yeah.
So the nonfiction you write now, so you were writing stuff for the Navy. So what type of nonfiction do you write now?
Well, now I mostly write reports, and they mostly reports having to do with cybersecurity compliance for combat systems. So not nearly as interesting as what I was doing before, but in terms of the writing part, it isn't. But it's vital work, and
that's where it's at right now. Cybersecurity is absolutely where the playing field is.
Yep.
And moving into space, both my wife and I are honorary commanders of the Space Force, which they have one of the main bases here in Los Angeles.
That's very cool.
And it's just amazing what's happening. We were there at the event where they unveiled the new logo, and we've been to some of the different briefings. And it's just, that is, Star Trek said it's space is the final frontier, but it really is. Whoever controls space controls the planet.
Well, have you seen anything about my latest novel, The Damocles Agenda?
So what
Just to give you a clue,
Yeah.
The tagline is "Space is the ultimate high ground."
Wow. Okay, good. Everybody listening, so you're gonna read Sea of Shadows, but now what's this other one now that I've not read that I've got to read now?
It's called The Damocles Agenda.
The Damocles Agenda. I did see that.
It's about weaponizing the International Space Station.
Wow. Okay, fine. Because they just had this thing just happened, last week, the week before, with Russia sending out and blowing up one of its satellites.
Yep.
So they say, well, it's just testing it, but it's just, you have the various posturing that's going on and what's happening right now with the posturing with Ukraine. It's definitely a real playing field that people need to deal with. It's what you're doing there in the cybersecurity, but also how that translates into satellite cybersecurity too is crazily important.
You're practically telegraphing the storyline of the Damocles Agenda right now, up to and including the posturing in Ukraine and the satellite stuff and cybersecurity and all of it.
Wow. Okay. I'm closed. I'm hooked. Okay, good. All right. So now we did talk briefly about Battlefield. So you also, in addition to writing nonfiction and your military fiction, you also write science fiction. I've not read any of your science fiction, but you had mentioned that you're familiar with Battlefield Earth. So what type of science fiction do you write?
Well, the two novels that I've written that are clearly science fiction are both kind of cyberpunk. They're looks at crime and law enforcement about 50 years into the future. Well, about 40 years into the future now.
And dropping.
Yeah, that time's catching up with me. Real life's catching up with me. But they're basically about they're kind of pseudo dystopian cyberpunk. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. New technology grafted on over old, and the ecosystem being continually ravaged by not being properly taken care of and things like that. But in the end, they're basically neo-noir. They're basically noir novels with a science fiction cyberpunk setting. I would argue that depending on how you squint your eyes, that even though it's a military thriller, that the Damocles Agenda is science fiction as well, in that it's writing about some things that are scientifically feasible but that haven't been done yet, and applications of technologies that have not yet been seen in the real world, although they exist but they haven't been seen in action in the real world, and kind of how those things can alter the possible future of humanity. So
yeah, it's interesting you say that, because you mentioned Michael Crichton. He never wrote anything but science fiction, and some of the other military fiction where they write these high-tech warships and planes and stuff, that by definition is science fiction. They didn't get marketed as science fiction, but they actually were science fiction.
Yeah, it's it depends on, like I say, it depends on how you hold your head and squint your eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
The interesting thing is, and this is kind of an odd thing as an author that I've discovered that I have two completely different readerships. I have readers who think I should write science fiction all the time and leave the military stuff alone. I have readers who think I should write military fiction all the time and leave the science fiction alone. There's not a lot of crossover between my two audiences. I really thought that given the fact that I do have there are certain elements of my style that carry through in everything that I write, and there are certain techniques that I use that are kind of signatures of mine. And I really kind of always assumed that if I hooked people in one genre, that most of the same people would go over and read the other genre. But it turns out that that's not true. It turns out that my science fiction fans are my science fiction fans, and my military fans are my military fans. And there's not a lot of crossover between those two groups.
Wow. Because it is interesting how a lot of times military fiction, at least the futuristic technology, is science fiction, but it never gets marketed. So people don't realize it and recognize it as science fiction, even though that's what it is, near future science fiction.
Yep.
And a lot of times science fiction, because it's set so far into the future, could actually be military fiction, but because it's so far in the future, it's easy to keep it into that category of science fiction.
Yeah. I completely agree.
Yeah, the ray guns and the spaceships and whatnot. Okay, that's not military fiction. That's science fiction. But yet, Star Trek is military fiction. If you just break it down, but because it's so far in the future, it gets continue to be relegated as strictly science fiction.
Yeah, and it's also military fiction is also science fiction when you take into account the fact that we're building ray guns, we're building we're not so much ray guns, we're building combat quality lasers, and we're building rail guns, and we're building the technologies that 50 years ago were absolute pie in the sky.
Yeah.
Or the fact that other than the fact that there's not a human on board, an intercontinental ballistic missile is a spacecraft.
Yeah.
It gets, it flies a very similar path to what the first American astronaut did. Our very first launch was a suborbital, and didn't even get into orbit. And but it's like that's kind of the path that an ICBM takes.
Yeah, it's interesting on that, and that's one of the things too about L. Ron Hubbard, because he had a lot of experience in the military, and you reviewed some of the stuff. Were you very familiar with his history as a military officer?
I actually kind of was, yeah, because I know that there's a friendship between him and Robert Heinlein, and Heinlein wrote about him and spoke about him quite a bit. So I kind of backed into knowledge about L. Ron Hubbard's military career through that particular vector. But yeah, I've kind of been aware of that for a good long time.
Yeah, and one thing they talked about was a lot of his fellow science fiction writers back in what became known as the golden age of science fiction were themselves the research scientists, the rocket scientists. They were the ones that were like taking these concepts that were first made known in science fiction and translating that into the real world, into the rockets, into the technologies, which then led to what we're seeing now.
I completely agree.
Some of the photos that I've got from Mr. Hubbard when he was at a science fiction convention in 1940, I think it was 42 in Toronto, the first TorCon. And there were the various other people in that photo with him. They were all themselves rocket scientists of the day, like Willie Ley. And so it's just interesting. These were the ones who were very much like Frank Wilson, Murray Leinster. These were all top scientists of the day who were also writing science fiction.
Yeah.
So they were both conceiving it and writing about it.
Yes.
So now you read Battlefield Earth. What was your thought of that one there? Because that's the book that he wrote just before launching Writers of the Future.
I just think that book is a lot of fun. It's a great deal of fun. It's like, how many times in history have we seen an alien invasion story where the aliens come in, they're on the planet, we're fighting them and everything else, and at the last minute we manage to stave off the invasion, and and humanity. But this is a case of humanity is utterly defeated. As Tarl famously says right in the opening line, man is an endangered species. It's like at that stage of the game, we're humanity we're like rats in the sewers. It's like we're of no consequence whatsoever to the Cyclos and to the galactic community or empire or hegemony or whatever it is you want to call it at all. We're of zero consequence. We're not even of any consequence on our own planet. And watching basically humanity rise from something approaching savagery and learn the culture and technologies of other races and grab a foothold and climb back into ascendancy again it's just good fun. And it's one of those things where some of the chapters you just end up cheering.
Yeah, it definitely did that. And it was it's definitely good. Like yourself. There's definite scenes in there where what's going to happen is just, it starts off on the wrong foot with humanity. They got toasted, and we're now it starts off 1,000 years in the future, and taking back the planet and the whole thing, and how the hero Johnny considers himself the last Air Force. He was the last person because he saw the cadets, what they did there at the Air Force Academy, so many years ago. But again, it's, you definitely get his attitude towards the military, Hubbard's attitude towards the military in his fiction that he writes. He very much respects the military, and off and on the officers, but more so on the actual maybe the lower officers, like, like he was a lieutenant, but the non-coms, and that they're the ones that really are the ones that will ultimately wage the war. And it's their bravery, it's their honesty, it's their integrity that will ultimately win the day or not.
Yep.
You get that pretty loud and clear in his stories. And I get that pretty loud and clear in your stories too.
Well, I completely agree. It's funny. I've served under officers that, first of all, let me say this, and you'll hear me use this. If you read my work, you'll see this metaphor more than once. I believe that a good and reasonable member of the military is someone who has no desire whatsoever to fight. It's like being a firefighter. It's like being a firefighter. You train to put out fires. You think about putting out fires. You study putting out fires. You check your gear. You keep yourself in physical condition for it. You practice it, but nobody's sitting around the fire station saying, "Gee, I wish something catches on fire tonight." And if they do, they're not the people you want on your team. Right. It's like the last guy you want on your team is somebody who can't wait to reach for the holster. It's like you want people who will do the job when the time comes and do it to the best of their ability, but they're not looking forward to it. These are not people who want to go out there and pull the trigger. These are people who are willing to do it when the time comes, and they're proficient at it when the time comes, but that's not a position that they want. And so I write kind of a lot about that. And even though you don't desire to go into battle, even though you don't, if you're 19 and you still think you're invincible, and your introduction to warfare is Call of Duty, on the computer, on your Xbox or whatever, maybe you think going into battle is a great idea. But once you've actually, been out there and crossed swords and stuff like that, you discover that it ain't all it's cracked up to be, and there's not a whole lot of glory in it, no matter who wins. And but if you have to go into battle, you want to follow somebody who is good at what they do. And I served under officers that if you have to go into battle, it's like, I want to follow that. I want to follow that person, that captain, that lieutenant, that ensign, that whoever, that commander. That person knows what in the hell they're doing and cares about their troops and cares about the ship and cares about, they're not just thinking about their career. They're not thinking about their next promotion. They're thinking about, what do we have to do to accomplish the mission and to endanger our people as little as possible? Those are the people you want to follow into battle. I was fortunate enough to serve under quite a number of those, and I was unfortunate enough to serve under more than a few who had no business in uniform. Captain Wiley, if he seems like a realistic character, it's because he's an amalgam of 3 or 4 officers that I encountered in my career that never, ever, 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 ever should have been allowed to put on a uniform. It's like they were so busy playing the game of military that they didn't realize it's not a game.
Yeah. Well, that's good, because I suspected that, and because one of the questions I'm going to ask you then is the effect of your experiences in the military, because research is a big part of writing fiction. Good research makes the storytelling plausible. How much do you rely upon just your own experience versus research? How do those two play against each other?
Well, when you get a chance, take a look at the acknowledgments page for Sea of Shadows and look at the laundry list of people I had to thank for helping me with that book. I knew my little corner of it pretty well. I knew the anti-submarine warfare pieces and how I wanted to do those from a sonar technician's perspective. I knew the weapons involved and kind of how things work and the nature of submarines and everything else, but I've never been a helo pilot. There are many, many, many positions in that. I've never been a fire control technician for missiles and stuff. It's like there are many portions of that fell outside of my area of expertise. So I would say that the book that I wrote is 20% personal knowledge and experience and 80% research and talking to people who are smarter than I am.
Well, that's good to know. That's good, and that makes sense. And anybody listening to this thing here too, that's just an important thing too. Just another example with Hubbard, he wrote a book about the Coast Guard. It was a great story, He just figured I can just whip it out, so he wrote it, and it didn't sell. He said, "What the heck?" So then he actually went and researched and went and talked to the Coast Guard, went on one of their patrol boats and saw how it worked, and got the similar type thing where you've got the officers who were there, no business, wearing a uniform. And he did his research, and then you wrote the book and it became very, very successful. But it's just the need to actually research, even if it's something that you're generally familiar with, important to research and get the details as related, like you said, to the helo pilot. You saw it enough, but that doesn't mean you know actually what goes on in
Yep.
there and all the different intricacies of that, which is no reason to assume it'd be any less intricate than what you had with your anti-sub warfare that you did. So it's I think that's really important. Now, you've obviously obtained success as a writer. So any advice you've got for aspiring writers as regards to pitfalls you would have appreciated someone's timely advice before you tripped into it?
I would say the best advice that I can give to anybody, other than don't give up the dream, and that's the best piece of advice that I have for anybody, because it's one of those. Writing is a marathon, not a sprint. It's one of those things where you can have 3,000 rejections and they don't matter as soon as you get the first acceptance. That's the first thing. It's like keep polishing your craft and learning and everything else. But the other thing is always look for people before you ever submit your book to an editor, before you ever show your book to an agent or anything else. Get yourself a cadre of readers who can look you in the eye and tell you that your kids are ugly. I have a group, I call them my advanced readers, my advanced reader group. Some people call them beta readers. I have a group and the number varies. It's usually between 15 and 20 people or so that I can depend on to tell me, dude, this totally isn't working. And oh, by the way, you misspelled so-and-so. Do you realize that the spelling of that person's name changed between chapter 9 and chapter 10? And this part totally didn't work for me. And I hate that character. And why in the world would X character do this thing over here? And because I work with people who are capable of looking me in the eye and telling me that my kids are ugly, they help me correct things that I was never going to find myself. They help me find pacing issues and character motivation issues and things like that. Get yourself a group of beta readers. Now, before you get yourself that group of beta readers, that comes later. That comes after you finish the novel, after you finish your novel, after you've taken it as far as you can get, and you need people to give you honest. Before you get to that point, if you haven't finished the novel yet, you need an entirely different kind of reader. You need a reader that's going to pat you on the back and say, good boy, keep going. And the reason is because the easiest thing in the world to do is quit halfway through a novel if you don't think it's working. And every single book I've ever written, there's been a point in the story where I went, this is the one that doesn't work. This is the one I have to throw in the trash can and start over from scratch. This is the one that's completely failing. I'm never going to get there. I'm not going to finish this novel. And if I do, it's going to be crap. I have to push through that every time. I can't be working at that stage when I'm first writing the novel and when it's kicking my butt, when the idiosyncrasies of the book are still kicking my butt. I can't be around people who are going to tell me that my kids are ugly. I need everybody to tell me that my children are the most talented little darlings that they could possibly be, which is why I show my work to very few people until I've finished a complete first draft. My wife sees it ahead of time because she's got a good sense for how to help me correct problems without breaking my spirit. Once I've finished the first draft, beat the crap out of it. Let's figure out what's wrong with it and fix it. But during that stage where I'm not sure I can finish the book, that's when I need encouragement rather than honesty. Later on, after I've finished the book, I need brutal honesty. Tell me what doesn't work. Tell me what stinks. And if it sucks, how can I make it suck less? And luckily, I've been very fortunate to build up a group of kind of mostly the same people who are perfectly willing to tell me why a book doesn't work for them. And because of that, and you'll see that I tend to thank them in the acknowledgments page of my book, they tend to make me look like a much better writer than I actually am, because they spot 6,000 things between them that I never would have spotted myself.
Well, that's amazingly good advice. And I've never had that particular advice given like that before. I've always had the beta readers, but never the idea you need somebody who's going to encourage you. And then once you're done, then you go ahead and let's just start picking it apart.
Yeah,
that makes good sense.
Don't pick it apart till you've finished the first draft.
Good.
Before then, you're liable to walk away. At least I am.
Yeah. Well, that's good. A lot of people have walked away from that first book and never went back to it. So that's very good advice. Well, we've already gone through an hour. It's amazing. I knew this would happen. I just knew it would happen. So for someone to be able to find out about you, what would you recommend? I mean, I'm definitely recommending, which I've been saying all along throughout this this interview, Sea of Shadows, but anything else that you would recommend for someone to discover the works of Jeff Edwards?
Well, if people lean more towards science fiction, I would recommend probably either Dome City Blues or Angel City Blues. Or maybe if they just want to dabble their toes and find out what I'm like and they don't want to invest in an entire novel, I wrote a short story called Postcards from the Moon, which, by the way, touches on some of the writers you talked about, including Willie Lay. But it's a little piece of short fiction. It's probably, the audiobook's about 30 minutes long. You know, it's just a few thousand words. So if you want to dabble your toes and find out whether or not I'm any good, that's a good way to do it cheaply. I think you can get the ebook for about 99 cents and find out in 20 minutes whether or not I'm worth your time. If you're more into military fiction, I would recommend basically just pick up any one of them. It's, while I do write the books in a certain order, and while there are certain kind of jokes and connections that will come through if you start at the beginning, chronologically, my military thrillers are Sea of Shadows, The Seventh Angel, Sword of Shiva, Steel Wind, and The Damocles Agenda. But honestly, you could read the books in any order that you want to. It's not one of those things where you have to read book number 2 before you understand book number 3. I like to tell my wife I write every book from the theory that nobody's ever going to want to read another book by me. So I have to try to give you your the whole meal, dessert and vegetables and everything all in one package. So every book that I've written can stand by itself. So pick up any one of those and run with it if you're interested in military fiction. Or, and this is one more thing that I like to say, which is that I don't actually recommend reading my books because I think the author is an idiot, but I do recommend buying my books because it's a great investment, so just buy some, put them on the shelf. They look really pretty. Don't bother to read them.
Well, I'll take it the next step. I said, definitely, if you're going to buy it, then definitely read it because it's going to be worth your while.
Well, thank you.
They find you by going to jeffedwards.com?
Yep.
Excellent.
Absolutely. And if they can't remember that, just Google Jeff Edwards.
Good.
I'm usually the first thing that pops up.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jeff.
It has been an absolute pleasure.
And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Jeff.
Thank you.